While most headlines were dominated by noise, trade wars, tough talk, and tariff threats, a different story was unfolding quietly to the north. A proposed 70% tariff aimed at reshaping the auto industry made global headlines. It looked like a direct strike, a strategic upper hand in trade negotiations. But while the media focused on confrontation, Canada was doing something far more calculated. It didn't retaliate, it restructured. What followed wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was the beginning of a shift, one that quietly positioned Canada as a strategic fallback in North America's economic playbook. And few noticed it happening. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth one power shift at a time. And today, we're unpacking a move that's raising eyebrows across the continent. A strategic shift so subtle, yet so impactful, few saw it coming. Canada just made a defiant move the US can't ignore, and the ripple effects are already in motion. If you care about what's really driving global power, beyond the headlines, hit that subscribe button. When the threat of a 70% tariff surfaced, particularly targeting the auto sector, analysts braced for economic whiplash. The policy was designed to rattle, to trigger immediate rethinking of trade dependencies. But Canada didn't take the bait. It didn't lash out with countermeasures or escalate tensions in the press. Instead, Canadian officials and corporate leaders quietly reviewed the country's trade posture and its leverage. Rather than fight fire with fire, Canada assessed where it held silent strength. The move wasn't about confrontation, but about repositioning. This moment marked the beginning of what would become a quiet restructuring of Canada's economic identity. The country had long been seen as America's reliable trade partner. But now, it was about to prove it could be more than that. Behind the scenes, companies started recalculating the risks of U.S. volatility. Canada became the alternative, not because it shouted louder, but because it remained composed. The tariff shock exposed something that had been building for years, a subtle but growing confidence in Canada's strategic depth. And while the world waited for a loud response, Canada was already moving the chessboard. Most viewers saw the USMCA as a slightly updated version of NAFTA, but for Canada, it became a legal fortress. The new agreement, ratified just before the trade disruptions of the 2020s, gave Canada a clear advantage: rules-based protection. While tariffs made noise, the fine print of USMCA shielded Canada's automotive and agricultural sectors with specific provisions and timelines. Quietly, Canadian negotiators had ensured that sudden policy shocks from Washington couldn't derail cross-border trade overnight. That stability proved invaluable. For U.S. and international companies, Canada now represented a way to stay inside North America's trade zone without getting caught in the political crossfire. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Even as threats were made, factories kept running, trucks kept moving, and contracts remained intact. Canada's strategy wasn't to win the headlines, it was to win the long game, and the USMCA, often overlooked, became the silent backbone of that strategy. It sent a signal to investors, executives, and supply chain leaders. Canada was not only compliant, it was consistent. In an age of economic friction, that made all the difference. Before the tariff threat, before the policy friction, Canada had already been building. For years, it had invested heavily in infrastructure that few outside the trade world paid attention to: ports in Prince Rupert and Vancouver, rail corridors linking inland hubs, cold chain storage for food exports, and highway expansions at key border crossings. These weren't just national upgrades. They were designed to make Canada more attractive to global logistics networks. When supply chains got rattled by tariffs and uncertainty, Canada's infrastructure suddenly looked like an escape hatch. While the U.S. debated trade in the media, companies rerouted through Halifax, shifted distribution centers to Ontario, and leaned on Canadian rail to move goods faster than cargo ships could from Asia. What appeared to be a sudden pivot was actually the payoff of a long-term investment. Canada hadn't scrambled to respond. It had prepared in advance, and when the tariff shock came, it simply opened the gates. And as trade volumes quietly increased, a new reality settled in. The supply chain wasn't abandoning North America, it was redistributing within it. For multinational corporations, tariffs are more than policy. They're disruptions. Auto manufacturers, tech producers, aerospace firms, open lines, and slim margins. When the 70% tariff threat hit the news cycle, many began reconsidering their footprint. But not everyone looked overseas. Quietly, a shift began. Ford invested in Ontario. Stellantis announced upgrades to plants in Windsor. Aerospace firms started expanding in Quebec and Manitoba. Why? Because Canada offered something global headlines couldn't promise: risk mitigation. Unlike in the U.S., where trade policy could pivot overnight based on rhetoric, Canada presented a rare combination of labor stability, predictable regulation, and strong diplomatic ties with both the U.S. and EU. It didn't need to compete on cost. It competed on certainty. And that's what boardrooms were looking for. As global operations teams looked to de-risk their North American operations, Canada didn't need to advertise. Its track record spoke for itself. And as executives quietly shifted, contracts, production lines, and logistics chains northward, it became clear Canada hadn't just survived the tariff threat, it had become a strategic alternative to it. While tariffs focused attention on finished goods, Canada was quietly strengthening its position at the foundation: energy. In 2023 alone, over 60% of U.S. crude oil imports came from Canada, making it America's largest and most stable energy supplier. But oil was just the beginning. Canada also exports natural gas, hydropower, uranium, and critical minerals like nickel and potash. As the global economy scrambled to secure energy independence and transition toward renewables, Canada was already ahead. With massive hydroelectric capacity in Quebec, cross-border transmission deals with New York and New England, and new LNG terminals on the Pacific coast, Canada positioned itself as a critical energy bridge between the U.S. and Asia. And, in a world of geopolitical friction, energy equals leverage. So when the tariff threat emerged, Canada didn't just point to trade agreements, it pointed to pipelines, contracts, and grid interconnections that couldn't be easily untangled. This gave Canadian policymakers quiet influence and gave U.S. firms one more reason to deepen, not abandon, their northern supply routes. Canada wasn't loud about it, but it had something no policy could override: infrastructure rooted in the ground. Rather than react with counter-tariffs or aggressive rhetoric, Canada took a different approach. It opened the doors. Provincial governments began streamlining permit processes. Tax incentives were quietly introduced for industrial expansion, and Canadian trade officials reached out, not with threats, but with offers. The result? A quiet uptick in U.S. foreign direct investment. In 2024, American investment into Canadian manufacturing hit a 15-year high. Companies like Intel, GM, and Amazon began expanding operations north of the border, not because of fear, but because of opportunity. Canada didn't wait for global capital to come knocking. It made sure the runway was clear, and it worked. Trade volume between Canada and the U.S. remained resilient, even as tensions rose elsewhere. By positioning itself as the stable, rules-based alternative in North America, Canada attracted capital, not controversy. And unlike tit-for-tat policies that stall investment, Canada's quiet invitation offered long-term value. It was soft power in economic form, a lesson in what happens when diplomacy and pragmatism lead the way. Trust isn't earned in a crisis. It's built in the quiet years before one. And when economic tensions rise, capital doesn't chase the loudest voice. It looks for consistency. That's exactly what Canada offered. Predictable legal systems, transparent regulation, trade behavior that didn't shift with each election cycle. While other nations made headlines with sudden tariff threats, sanctions, or unpredictable policy turns, Canada became the quiet constant in an uncertain world. This reputation matters. Global logistics firms rerouted through Canadian ports not because they were the cheapest, but because they were reliable. Corporations chose Canada not just for lower risk, but for fewer surprises. The World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index consistently ranks Canada among the top 10 globally. And in 2025, the OECD projected Canada would become one of the top 3 destinations for North American reindustrialization investment, not because of scale, but because of trust. And in geopolitics, trust scales faster than fear. Canada's power wasn't in its size. It was in its consistency. While the global spotlight focused on drama, on tariff threats, retaliatory posturing, and economic finger-pointing, Canada was operating offstage. But that's where the real power shifts often happen. The 70% tariff didn't weaken Canada's position. It revealed it. It exposed the strength of its legal framework, the foresight of its infrastructure investment, and the quiet loyalty it had built with global corporations. Canada didn't need to escalate. It just needed to stay the course. And by doing so, it became something rare in today's geopolitical economy, a place where consistency is still a strategy. Supply chains didn't collapse. They rerouted. Investments didn't flee. They recalibrated. And behind it all, Canada remained the steady hand. The lesson here isn't just about trade, it's about leverage, not the kind shouted from podiums, but the kind built quietly over decades. The world missed it because it wasn't loud, but it was effective. And for companies watching this region closely, the message is clear. The quietest player just made the smartest move. If you found this breakdown insightful, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us track these quiet shifts in power before they show up in the headlines. Let us know in the comments. Is North America building resilience? Or is the U.S. quietly losing control? Either way, the map is changing, and we'll be here, one power shift at a time. This is how Canada just made a defiant move that the U.S. can't ignore. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.